Hello, everyone, from Alliance Magazine, and welcome to today's event, which is being produced in a very hot London, unequipped to handle it, so that makes our conversation today feel as timely as ever. I'm Elika Ruhi, the digital editor at Alliance and the moderator of today's digital event, which is sponsored by Fondation de France. Our conversation today will explore how philanthropy can leverage its influence to increase overall funding for loss and damage, a key climate justice issue. But first, just a few notes for everyone attending today. For everyone who's tuning in, go ahead and say hello in our chat, which you should be able to access by clicking on the chat bubble, which should be above at the top of the screen. Later on, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have any that you'd like to ask our panelists, make sure you put them here. You can also join in the discussion on Twitter with @AllianceMag and use the hashtag climate damage. Everyone attending this event today is entitled to a 20% discount on any Alliance subscription using the code EVENT22. An Alliance subscription gives you access to exclusive subscriber content, 4 issues of the magazine a year, and free access to all future events. You can find a link to our subscription page in the chat area now, and we'll also be following up by email afterwards with the offer and recording of this event. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to start by defining the term loss and damage. It's a particular phrase that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change uses to refer to the consequences of climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to, so like low-lying nations experiencing a rise in sea levels, or climate change that affects when options exist, but a community doesn't have the resources to access them, such as rebuilding after a severe weather event or weathering an extreme heat wave. The first mention of loss and damage by the UNFCCC was in 1991, but there's been little movement on financing it in the decades since. So today we want to talk about why and what to do about it. So that tough question we're going to put to our expert panelists. We're delighted to have all of you with us today. We're joined by Heather McGray, the director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, who joins us today from the US. Eva Peace Mukairenga is the founding member of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, and she is logging on from Rwanda. And Mohammed Shahjahan is the deputy director of the Young Power and Social Action Project, which addresses the rights of people displaced by climate in Bangladesh. So we're honored to have all of you with us today, and a special thanks to everyone, as always, for navigating the time zones to join our conversation. So first off, I'd like to turn the floor over to Eva. We've been told that climate change could cost the world as much as $500 billion a year by 2050, which is a staggering sum. But I also want to think about the human cost, which is a big part of your work, I think, with the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about that work, as well as your perspective on this subject from Rwanda?
Hi, thank you so much, and a pleasure to be able to discuss about loss and damage. I say I'm part of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is a global collaboration of more than 300 youth from the global north and the global south, aiming to pressure leaders to take action on loss and damage. And we hope for a world where the impacts of loss and damage are addressed in an equitable way, a world where developed countries take responsibility for their outsized contribution to the climate crisis by treating loss and damage with a sense of urgency. So our work mainly focuses on advocacy, which by lobbying governments, local and global leaders, and decision makers to scale up efforts to address loss and damage and provide finance to vulnerable communities on the ground. We did this by sending open letters, and we recently launched an open letter to the COP27 presidency with our main demands ahead of the COP27. But I also develop resource materials for youth to be able to engage in work related to loss and damage and collect and share their stories on the global level, also on their perspective on how they're affected by the impacts of climate change. And this also support our advocacy and demands around loss and damage. So as you say, loss and damage is not a new concept and something that has been there for ages, like since 1991. Developing countries have been calling for finance for loss and damage, but there have been no solution, no concrete action provided by global leaders. So it's not a new concept. And in Rwanda and many developing countries and least developing countries, small islands, we've been facing cyclone, flooding, erosion, drought, and this is emphasized also by the lack of capacity to also to be able to help our community to address loss and damage. So we now call it the term loss and damage. It's backed up by the process of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, the WIM, but something that has been there for ages, and we've been facing the impacts of loss and damage. So we hope at this stage that the philanthropies also can support. The best way is support local actors and local communities on the ground to understand their needs when it comes to loss and damage, because loss and damage is it's come in different contexts and different realities in different parts of the world. So it needs to understand the needs of different countries and to be able to provide solution that fits their needs. So this will be reached by putting the voice of those affected at the front, and funding to be governed by people affected and not other local politicians. So any support provided should be driven by the needs of the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. Before I pass on, I'm wondering if in your work you've seen examples of working with philanthropy or private funders that have sort of helped you advance on this issue.
Yeah, so we've been receiving support to be able to drive our work in the Loss and Damage Coalition, to be able to advocate for loss and damage. We've been supporting, taking part in decision making, and we have been having delegation recently at COP26 and also at the SPs recently in June at Bonn. So we have the people, we have among our delegation negotiators who are part of taking decision, who contribute, but also we were able to have support in sharing our stories, and yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eva. Next, I want to turn the floor over to Heather. So could you tell us a little bit about how the Climate Justice Resilience Fund is thinking about funding loss and damage in your work in that area?
Sure. Thanks very much. The Climate Justice Resilience Fund is a pooled fund that's been in place a bit more than 5 years now. And we were created at a time when climate justice was still nascent as a piece of the dialogue. There were fewer organizations and people who were using the term climate justice. So we've been really, in some ways, an innovating grant maker, trying to explore what does it mean to support climate justice, and how do you do this. We currently have funding from 4 different foundations. And when we complete our kind of 6th year this year, we'll have programmed about $20 million. Our strategic framework from the outset has had us focused on some of the issue areas where climate change really touches people's lives and livelihoods and their human rights. We've focused on food security and food sovereignty. We've focused on access to water. And of course, these are issues that we're seeing really take the center stage as climate change accelerates. We've focused on livelihoods and the need for sustainable livelihoods that can help people thrive as the climate changes. And then our 4th issue area has been migration and relocation. And this is where I think in many ways we've interfaced most closely with the loss and damage conversation. When people are losing their land, when they're losing their homes, when they're forced to move, this is one of the most serious injustices that we see from climate change, and we're seeing it on a much larger scale, and we're expecting it on an even larger scale as climate change progresses. So this is how we entered the loss and damage conversation, and you'll see that we've learned very much that this issue of migration and relocation and displacement, it's actually really connected with food, with water, with livelihoods. We worked with IPSA, and you'll hear in more detail from Shah Jahan later in the panel, as an example of what it really takes to address these issues. You can't only work on one front. We also, as kind of one of the earliest climate justice funds, we connected up with Scotland's Climate Justice Fund a few years ago. And mostly it was just, an occasional conversation, and we both had evaluations done around the same time. We were exploring ways to get the word out together about what it takes to fund climate justice. Right around the time that Scotland's First Minister took the decision to really become the first wealthy country to explicitly fund action to address loss and damage. This was at the Glasgow climate change talks last fall. And so our kind of budding conversations with the Climate Justice Fund moved into a partnership around loss and damage. And we're actually the fund that's deploying Scotland's commitment of £1 million, the first wealthy country's commitment on this issue. A really interesting thing happened in Glasgow as a result of Scotland's leadership. But I'd like to think our work within the Climate Justice Just Transition Donors Collaborative also had a role to play in this. We hosted the collaborative, which is run by Farhana Yamin, and there's 5 of us, I think, that are the core founders of the collaborative. It hosted a major event for philanthropy on the margins of the climate change talks. And loss and damage became a central conversation in that event. Activists were raising this issue of loss and damage as an important one, not only for last year's COP, but also for philanthropy and for climate justice more broadly. So one thing led to another. Several foundations stepped to the plate to fund loss and damage and to support, in particular, advocacy and action around a loss and damage facility. A lot of that funding is moving through the Climate Emergency Coordination Group. It's also moving through the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which has an interesting fund that's getting developed. This is a coalition of the world's most vulnerable countries. So there's a whole range of actors that are coming together, but philanthropy is playing a leadership role here. That was a brave act, I think, and I'm looking forward to further collaboration and to seeing what we're able to do together this year on advocacy at the coming COP, but even more importantly on the ground. And that's where our work and where the Scottish partnership that we've been shepherding is focused. We're supporting work that, as Eva just said, we're supporting work that is driven as much as possible by local communities and by their priorities as they experience loss and damage and as they look forward to it. And one of the things we've found as a climate justice funder is that often what communities need and what they prioritize is not that intuitive to a funder who works globally and who's thinking very differently than people think on the ground when they experience this loss and damage. One of the places where we work is in the Arctic. We've been supporting Native communities in northern Alaska and in parts of Canada to deal with very rapid change and a great deal of loss and damage that's coming from the loss of ice and the melting of tundra. And some of what communities want to see in response to huge systemic changes in their environment. This is not just nuts and bolts relocating homes or just finding places for communities to relocate. That's really important and needed, but there's huge cultural shifts taking place as well. And there's really important social dimensions of this. So we're supporting work in the Arctic that maybe doesn't necessarily look exactly like climate work, but it's very linked. And our partners have shown us how, for example, cultural revitalization, work around art, around music, around language. This is some of what's most important in the Arctic, and where we've seen loss and damage activities are not intuitive for what many grant makers think. So I'll leave it at that for now. There's lots to unpack on this. It's a really core and important issue. So thank you to Alliance for creating this space for the conversation.
Thanks, Heather. That's all really interesting and lots of things that I would love to come back to in the Q&A. But just before I pass on to Shahjahan, I wanted to ask you about the Climate Justice Just Transition Donor Collaborative. So you were saying that funding of loss and damage doesn't always look like funding climate. And I was wondering, how do you encourage your partners to think about this then? Like, what are the conversations that you're having and what can other people interested in being in this space think about?
Yeah, this has been a really interesting piece of being a climate justice funder, and it comes up a lot in the conversations with the other funders in the collaborative. Um, Everyone comes to this issue from a different angle. We collaborate with women's rights funders. We collaborate with funders focused on children. We collaborate with people who've been working on global human rights and didn't think about climate change for decades as a funder. But people are starting to see how climate change intersects with so many different issues. And those intersections are where the losses are emerging. When you're losing your food security, when you're losing your livelihood, there's a whole range of funding expertise that come to bear on this. And so organizations that have been working on agriculture for the last 30 years, that's not just a technical question. It's a question of justice and of rights now, and of climate change impacting people's rights. So this is a lot of what we're unpacking in that collaborative. A lot of conversations around how different aspects of different funders' agendas are coming to the fore now on climate justice and on the just transition to a new system. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. All right, so next I want to hear from Shah Jahan. So you're the director of Young Power and Social Action, which is a project that supports climate displaced peoples inside Bangladesh. And I know your project is funded by the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. Can you share with us a little bit about your work?
Thank you very much. My organization name is the Young Power in Social Action. The short name is the YPS, IPSA. It's an organization has a special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council since 2013. It is a voluntary, non-profit organization for sustainable development, contributing to the national goals for making a difference in the lives of the population since its establishment in 1985. That is International Youth Year. IPSA, a fleet of more than 1,300 full-time professional staff who has specializes in 6 thematic areas: health, education, human rights and governance, economic empowerment, environment and climate change, and finally disaster risk reduction and humanitarian responses. Actually, we are working under these 6 thematic areas. IPSA's ambitions a society without poverty, where everyone's basic needs and rights are ensured. As its mission, IPSA has seeks to participate with the poor and vulnerable population with all commitments to bring about their own and society's sustainable development. Currently, IPSA is working with a total 14 million estimated disadvantaged and vulnerable people in Bangladesh. Under the theme of the environment and climate change, IPSA has been implementing different need-based projects with the focus on environmental improvement and population control management, restoration and conservation of biodiversity, rights and needs of the climate-induced displaced people, including plant relocation, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, social forestry and alternative livelihood, ecotourism, potable water supply. We are working different projects under these focusing areas. Now, IPSA's work with climate for displaced people under loss and damage. Climate-induced displacement is the best example of the loss and damages, particularly when displacement is prolonged due to extreme event. IPSA has been working with climate for displacement issues under the broader theme of the loss and damage. As we know that loss and damage may occur where adaptation limits are reached, because actions are unaffordable, not physically and technically possible, and where adaptation has not been optimally implemented. Now, the question is why IPSA focuses on climate for displacement issues. As you know that recent World Bank report estimated that climate change could displace 216 million people across 6 world regions to move within their countries by 2050, where 40 million is in the South Asia. According to the displacement solutions, 1 in every 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced by 2050. And recent IDMC report, we have seen that 4.4 million people displaced in 2020 in Bangladesh due to disaster event, which is 15% of the total disaster displacement in 2020. In this year, we have flood in northeastern part of Bangladesh, and which displaced 500,000 people in Bangladesh. Now it is running on. Actually, what happened after the displacement? Displaced people become landless, homeless, and assetless, suffer from livelihood insecurity. They have been denied access to basic rights, basic services, suppose food, education, health, safe water, sanitation, etc., and deprived from the cultural harmony. Since 2011, IFSHA starts to understand the problem and finding solution of the climate for displacement in Bangladesh. With the support of Displacement Solution, and the initiative name is the Bangladesh Housing, Land and Property Rights Initiative. Initially, we try to understand the problem and finding the solution. And under this initiative, IFSHA has undertaken different researches that had resulted in number of groundbreaking publications on the issue, which is available in our website, www.ifsha.org. Since 2018, after different study and discussion with the community and the capacity building with the different government and non-government agency people, we have understood that we should take some initiative directly to address the needs and rights of the climate protected displaced people. And at that time, we have we got the support from the Climate Justice Resilient Fund. And since 2018, we have been providing direct work with the climate. We have been providing different need-based services and doing advocacy for and with the climate displaced people. We have been forming different community team within this community setting, as well as we are providing the different capacity building support to the community team and displaced people, so that they can claim their right from their duty bearers, from different duty bearers. At the same time, we're also doing some advocacy with the different stakeholders, particularly with the government and the local elected bodies, so that they can come forward to provide the need-based support to the climate displaced people. At the same time, we are also providing some need-based support, particularly water and sanitation support to the displaced people. And finally, we are also doing some relocation program, particularly the community-based plan relocation program. As you all know that Bangladesh government has the relocation program, but there is some difference from our relocation program and the government relocation program. Our relocation program, particularly with the community settings, so that this can be the sustainable model. And so far, we have seen that our relocation program is sustainable and durable. On the other hand, there is a different types of relocation program in Bangladesh, but we found that there is some gap, particularly when they were relocated in the large number of people in the one place, they are being stigmatized in the sometime. So for the reason, we are very much careful to relocate the people, and we are giving priority to relocate the people in the community setting. So far, we know that in the COP26, there is no critical outcome from the loss and damage issues, no agreement on the establishment of the finance facility for the loss and damage. But we cannot actually wait for this global commitment. We should start the work from the ground zero, because people are suffering and people are really living very vulnerable situation at the ground zero. So we are trying to mobilize the philanthropic fund, and philanthropic can support and mobilize greater opinion on this. Also could have established a full fund for supporting CSO initiative for addressing loss and damage. This could be aligned to the human rights dimension of addressing climate change and loss and damage, but should not be considered as the only financing mechanism for addressing loss and damage. And because there is a climate justice issue. So as Bangladesh, as you all know that the Bangladesh is a vulnerable country, but Bangladesh is not contributing much to the climate change. So we are always trying to convince the developed countries so that they can come forward. The developed countries should come forward with the technical and financial support as the compensation. And climate for displacement and migration issue should be treated as separate agenda under UNFCCC. There should be legal framework at the international level under UNFCCC to deal climate for displacement in human rights perspective. Considering the reality of cross-border migration, there should have an universal framework for facilitating migration and resettlement under the UNFCCC. So I will stop here, and next time I will talk more if there is any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shahjahan. Just before we open it up to the Q&A, I wanted to ask you, in Bangladesh, is there a conversation about climate justice? Like, what are the issues of climate justice that are really being talked about there? Because I know you were citing these like quite staggering statistics of 1 in 7 people will be displaced. I know there have also been like very, very large heat waves there that would put our 2-day heat wave here to shame. And so I'm just wondering, how is the conversation on climate justice where you're at?
Yes, as a CSO, we have the dual role actually. When actually we do the advocacy in the Bangladesh, we do advocacy with the government, because this is the ultimate responsibility of the state government. And in the grassroots level where we are working at this moment, and also the international level, we do advocacy with the government so that government should deal this issue from their as the rights of the climate displaced people. But when actually we do advocacy in the international level, our main point is Bangladesh is not liable for this climate change. People displacement is happening due to the cause of the developed countries. So we are actually try to influence developed country to come forward with the compensation. And Bangladesh government, when actually we go to the COP, and that time actually Bangladesh government and all the CSOs from the Bangladesh, we have the one agenda to give pressure to the developed nations, because they are actually this is now become the politics. Climate change, particularly in the loss and damage issue, have been the political issue. So so far there is no funding, as you know that, though this issue actually come into the account on 2013, but still now there is no single fund created on this issue. So our main agenda is to influence the international community, particularly developed nation, so that they can come forward with the technical and financial support as a compensation. Over.
Thank you. Yeah, all really interesting. I think now we're going to open it up to a Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone that you can, if you have any questions for our panel, you can put them in the chat. So the chat icon should be above the videos, and then it should appear on the right-hand side of your screen. So if there's anything on your mind today about funding loss and damage, go ahead and share. I want to start with a question from Don Cipriani, who asks, with funding for loss and damage being, by definition, a response to a monumental negative harm, what would a community-grounded affirmative vision in this space look like? What are some illustrative examples of community-driven progress towards such a vision? And I was wondering if I could ask Eva to come in on this question first. Eva, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you please repeat?
Yeah, of course.
Still
No problem. It's also in the chat. So there's a question from Don Cipriani who asks, With funding for loss and damage being by definition a response to a monumental negative harm, what would a community-grounded affirmative vision in this space look like? What are some illustrative examples of community-driven progress towards such a vision?
Thank you. I think, as said from the recent presentation, Bangladesh is one of the best examples to give on how the community lead is taking the lead in addressing loss and damage. But a community vision would, I'll say like an example for example, from Rwanda, my own country, what will look like. Rwanda will be facing mostly we've been affected when it comes to loss and damage with drought and floods, and also affecting our lands and our populations, mainly most high percentage are farmers, little farmers, and these floods affect hugely the crop and food security. So when for funding for loss and damage was nowhere, you must be driven by the community, must tell you what they need. So far needs, what needs they are, the irrigation, what would be, does it mean that the farming people have to relocate, or do they need like irrigation, smart agriculture, smart agriculture tools? So whatever the community needs, they are usually the one who will be able to tell you what they need. And in order to avoid like a maladaptation, so to come up with a solution that won't be helpful to the community. So the community, what they need so far, is it like an irrigation, smart agriculture process, or is it like a relocation? So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Lydia Baker, who says, as mentioned in the intro, loss and damage as a concept has been around for a while, since 1991. Why do the speakers think that it is only starting to gain momentum now? I want to direct that one to Heather, because I'm sure you're in a lot of conversations about this question, so I'd love to hear your point of view.
Sure. I wish Tony was here. He'd have a really good perspective on this. But quite honestly, governments and leaders of all stripes in corporations, in the nonprofit community, in philanthropy, everywhere, people have really had their heads in the sand about this. There has been, I think, a lot of denial around how serious climate change is and what it really means when people are displaced by the climate. And I mean, you know, denial is classically one of the stages of grief. This is a very human thing to be in denial. It's also politically expedient for a lot of leaders, and because there aren't a lot of easy solutions for loss and damage, and a lot of people don't want to confront problems that don't have solutions. But you can see in the examples you've just heard from Eva and from Shah Jahan, there are communities out there working on this. They're working together on this. They're figuring out how to address some of these really grievous injustices. And, you know, an example, this is maybe another answer to Don's question. We supported a really unique workshop a few years back together with UUSC, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. And we brought together communities in Alaska and communities in the Pacific Islands. And a few other community representatives. Shah Jahan was able to join us all the way from Bangladesh to Alaska. These communities came together for 3 days and just talked about what they're doing on climate forced displacement. And that was a really wide-ranging workshop that had a lot of open space, and things wouldn't you wouldn't necessarily expect to come up around confronting historical trauma with psychological measures, a lot of spirituality on the table from Indigenous communities as important solutions for these issues, and also music and dance, in addition to the nuts and bolts of navigating very difficult federal regulations in Alaska, or moving people brick by brick and livelihood by livelihood in Bangladesh. These solution sets have to all be on the table together, and you can look up the outcome from that workshop. It's called the First Peoples Manifesto on Climate Force Displacement, and a lot of the solutions coming from communities and their vision for how to address this really should inspire the leaders who've been feeling very stuck for a long time.
Thanks, Heather. That actually leads us in really nicely to our next question, speaking about how communities are moving themselves. So I'd love to hear actually from each of you on this question. What do you want to see coming out of COP27 on this issue? So Heather, if you maybe want to start, and then Shahjahan, and then Eva. I'd love to hear about what each of your organizations are thinking about as COP27 approaches.
My colleague Aisha is in the audience here, and she may want to chime in on the chat. It's still early days for us in developing our plans for COP. We haven't had a chance to coordinate yet with our grant partners, and as a funder, that's our top priority, is to lift up the voices of our grantee partners and support their advocacy, support their sharing of their experience. And in general, that's what we see as a really valuable component of COP, is to share experience and to facilitate voices from the local level and from the national level being heard on the global stage, and having a chance to exchange with people in the movement who are from other places and are also bringing creativity to the table. So we'll have quite a few events focused on that, is my guess. We're also working, with the government of Scotland, who are hopefully in an important position on this. They're planning a conference on loss and damage in the lead up to COP, and I'm hopeful that our grant making will be, still very early days, honestly, in terms of the new initiative we launched with Scotland last year. But we'll have lessons feeding into the COP through that Scottish sponsored event, and then through our own learning and exchange activities.
Thanks, Heather. Shahjahan, do you want to jump in on this question about what you're hoping to see out of COP27?
Yes, we are always have to be the hopeful. So the major concern of loss and damage negotiation is how to address loss and damage on the ground with the legally established financing and funding mechanism under the UNFCCC. Though there is a party level negotiation, there is a event from the civil society, but all have the same concern that there is still there is no commitment from the developed countries on the loss and damage. So though there is a diverse opinion on this, however, establishing a financial facility under a separate government structure, fund board maybe, should be the key concern at COP27, particularly on the loss and damage issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Eva, I would love to hear from you on any preview you can share about what the Youth Coalition has in mind for COP27 and what you're hoping to see from it.
Thank you. For us to have a campaign on loss and damage finance now, so it's pretty explanatory. And for the COP27, we want to be able calling for the establishment of a loss and damage facility, and also there's quite a number of agenda like the Santiago network, which will allow having the technical assistance on the ground. So we hope for a full operationalization of the Santiago network, and also the establishment of loss and damage finance facility, which will allow unlocking finance for the vulnerable community.
Thanks, Eva. Great. Yeah, it's really, really exciting to hear about all of these plans, and I think Alliance will look forward to covering this year's COP. Last year we were in Glasgow actually, and Heather, we were at your event that you were speaking about with the Scottish government. And this year we won't be in Egypt, but we will definitely be providing a lot of coverage of Philanthropy's contribution to the COP. So next I want to turn to a question from Rosine Uineza, apologies if I mispronounced your name, at Impatience Earth, who asks, does the concept of loss and damage relate in any way to the concept of reparations? And from a political standpoint, might the resistance to funding for loss and damage that we see from governments be driven by resistance to engaging in conversations about reparations? Does anyone want to jump in on that one before I assign it?
The short answer is yes.
Eva or Shahjahan, do you have anything to add to this question?
Could you please repeat
Sorry.
Let's hear from Eva first, and then we'll turn it over.
I was just going to say, like, any language shouldn't be in the way of providing support to people who need it. So it doesn't make sense to not provide finance for loss and damage in terms of because of a language or reparations. And I mean, developing countries also have been contributing we talk in terms of solidarity. There is a need to work together to collaborate. We're on the same planet. We are all facing the climate change impact, but we have different resources. So there's need to collaborate together to be able to support people's facing the climate change impact.
Thank you. Shahjahan, did you want to share anything on this question? All right, well, maybe we can take another question if there are no more comments on this one. I think it's a really interesting idea and one that we would actually love to explore at Alliance a little bit more. So I'll put on my editor hat for a moment and say we will always take pitches. I want to talk a little bit about models that philanthropy can catalyze to sort of kickstart funding for loss and damage. So at last year's COP, there was a pledge of 3 million by a couple of different funders. And I think it was sort of trying to be in the model of the methane pledge, where philanthropy says we'll commit a certain amount of money, and then governments feel confident, that there will be finance there, and then they also sign on and they can commit much more funding. But in an interview with Lawrence Tubiano, which actually we published today, she said that was purely symbolic. So they committed a little bit of funding, it was symbolic funding, and then it hasn't really catalyzed anything or gone anywhere. So do we think that this model could work, and what other models are we thinking about? So first, I want to throw that to Heather, and then we'll put it to the other panelists.
I have to say there's a need for a lot of creativity on this right now. We, at CDRF, we're taking on the slice of providing examples, of supporting leading examples on how do you address loss and damage, and supporting leading examples that are community driven. The question of what do the funding structures look like, there's definitely a role there for philanthropy as well. And I think folks from CECG would be good ones to talk to if any of them are here in the audience around the kinds of ideas that they're hearing about and where they see there's a need for an opportunity for funding of the advocacy and the model development. But I think I think there's a lot of misgivings in the philanthropic community and in the advocacy community around what we've seen from other global funds. They're slow. They are not really up to the urgency of this task. And especially when they're as political as loss and damage is, it's not easy to create a new green climate fund and having have it function well enough to do what needs to get done. So we welcome creative ideas at CJRF, and we are in conversation with other philanthropic colleagues around what could this be? What could it look like?
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I think you're right that big funders can be very slow. And I wanted to turn it now to Shah Jahan, if you are still connected and able to hear us. I'd love to ask you, as somebody who is a grantee and you're working on the ground on a very critical issue, how are you getting across the urgency with the funders that you speak with?
Yes, thank you. Actually, loss and damage fund, we always expect to create this fund under UNFCCC process. But whenever philanthropy come forward with this fund, this is very much welcome, because this is the ground reality. People, we should stand, particularly in the CSO, should stand beside the vulnerable people. Those are already been displaced and face the loss and damage. So we always welcome the philanthropic funding and to establish a pool fund for supporting the CSOs to addressing the loss and damage. So particularly, but ultimately to have the better solution and comprehensive solution, it is very much important to have the big funding under the UNFCCC process, and developed countries should come forward.
Thank you. Our next question is from Harriet, who asks, and Eva, I'm going to put this one to you. She says, how does loss and damage intersect with issues of intergenerational justice? How active or not are youth-led organizations on issues of loss and damage? And what can philanthropists do to support young people to participate in these debates? I was wondering, from your experience on the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, what have you seen that's worked? What support has been useful to you? It'd be really great to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you so much. I think I would say young people have been at the center in driving and calling for support for loss and damage. And I said loss and damage youth coalitions, mostly now it's a global movement with people from the global south and the global north, and there is huge interest from people in different backgrounds to take part in demanding support for loss and damage. And so far we have like interests, and I would say this looking into COP26, I think the loss and damage gained a huge momentum because of the civil society, youth organization, people outside of the negotiation who put pressure on negotiators and leaders to provide support for loss and damage. And young people have been playing a role in that. And in terms of what can philanthropists do to support young people, we have the solution. We have the ideas. So far, we've been in the loss and damage group. We've been listened to. We've been provided a platform. So it's a matter of being listened to. We have the solution. We have our own ideas, our own contribution, depending on our own context. So we've been providing like trainings. We've been collecting stories on how we are affected by climate change impacts. We've been trying to take part in decision making by taking part in the COP and other international negotiations. So young people are there and they are working. It's a matter of listening and providing the resource needed to be able to implement our solutions.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you.
So next we have a question from Razu Ahmad Masoom, who asks, how are governments and organizations creating spaces for communities so they can discuss and set their loss and damage related priorities? So all of you participate in these conversations and in these spaces in a different way. And I was wondering if you could each share a little bit about about how they come about and how you create the space for these conversations. So maybe Shah Jahan, you can start, and then Heather, and then Eva.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, community is our actually main uh, area where actually we can involve them with this process. You will be happy to know that my organization as is the co-organizer of SDG Youth Summit, which is going to be happen in from 23rd to 25th in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, and this month. And this is the one of the big issues that this youth summit will be mainly focused on the climate change issue. And youth are very much engaged and involved. We are providing the technical support, capacity building support to the youth so that they can actually do their proper campaign and they can uh, uh, influence the state government as well as the international community on this issue. And our always focus to the community people, and we whenever actually we do any activities for the community, first we we uh, provide capacity building stuff to the community people so that they can claim their right from the relevant authorities. Otherwise, if the outsider cannot uh, uh, solve their problem from the outside. So community is actually our the center of our all activities, and we provide technical support and we provide awareness session. We also do the capacity building support with the community people, and they actually do their campaign for their rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather, can you share on this question about creating spaces for priorities about loss and damage?
Yeah, a great example is a new partnership we have with a coalition in the Pacific Islands who are supporting community-led organizations to conduct assessments around what loss and damage they've already faced, what loss and damage is coming down the pike, and then facilitate conversations around what do communities want? How do they want to address it? And I think we're going to see the answers are going to look really different from community to community. That's certainly what we see in Alaska also. But that communities are able to support each other through networks of civil society organizations. And so there's sort of layers of these conversations happening of organizations that facilitate community-led discussion, and then coalitions of organizations working at the national level. Aisha joined a session in Fiji not long ago that was across the Pacific, so a regional conversation. And this kind of building up of priorities from the ground up is part of what we hope to facilitate.
Thank you. Eva, do you have anything to add to this question? So the question was about spaces for communities to talk about priorities for loss and damage. So if you have anything to add from your own experience, it would be great to hear your insights. Right. Maybe there's a connection problem there. We are coming up on the end of our hour very quickly, so I actually wanted to take a different question for our last question. So I think with climate, the issue can feel so large, and it's really easy to get caught up in climate doom, which then I think it stops us from being able to mobilize, and it makes us feel more apathetic when we're just sort of despairing about this. So I'm wondering, with your work on this topic, particularly the loss and damage side of climate, how are you keeping hope? So maybe we can start with Shah Jahan, especially with your work with refugees. How are you keeping hope with your work on loss and damage? Okay, maybe Heather, I'll turn it to you first while the others try to reconnect.
sorry, sorry, I was in mute.
No
Actually,
problem.
as I mentioned, though there is no big hope from the international community, particularly in the developed nations, on the loss and damage issue. But philanthropy actually already started to coming forward to funding on these issues. Uh, there is a best example already Heather mentions, and we hope that in the coming time there will be the more funding on this issue, and those who we are working in the grassroots level, actually this funding will be benefited our vulnerable people. Those are the victim of the loss and damage. So we are very much hopeful.
Thank you. Heather, do you have anything to share on this one?
I mean, on some level, hope is a choice we all make. And for myself, I'm able to keep making that in part through, engaging with my own family and friends and spending time in ways that nourish myself. Spirituality and religion are helpful in this too. But in terms of what's happening on loss and damage and what is giving me hope in the climate policy space, the collaborations are what give me hope. And when Scotland stepped forward last year and then Philanthropy followed, and then the conversations like this one have been starting to happen, this is hopeful for me. It's very hopeful. And we at CJRF, we welcome engagement in the work that we're doing. There's plenty of work to fund, and we can help funders find it. We also welcome participation in the Climate Justice Just Transition at Donors Collaborative events. There's events coming up, I think, every month this year, either online or in person. And those collaborations are what gives me hope.
Thank you. Eva, I'd love to hear from you on this question if you are still able to access, if you're on mute. You can go ahead and unmute. Actually, I think we might have lost her, unfortunately. All right, well, thank you everyone so much today for your contributions to our conversation. And thank you as well for finding your way to this webinar platform. We did have to change because of technical difficulties with our normal space where we host our digital events. I hope that you've enjoyed today's discussion. This event was part of our Climate Philanthropy 2030 project, which is a reporting project to cover global philanthropy. For anyone who's interested in our coverage of climate philanthropy, you can find it at alliancemagazine.org/climate. And if you found today's conversation helpful and engaging, don't forget to subscribe to Alliance with the code EVENT22. We'll also be sending out emails to you shortly with the discount code, as well as a recording and a recap of today's events. I'd like to end by saying thank you to our expert panelists, Eva, Heather, and Shahjahan. And thank you as well to Tony Lavinia, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us today, but he also planned to contribute to our conversation about loss and funding, and hopefully we'll get to again in the future. Thank you to the Alliance team, in particular, our marketing, advertising, and events manager, Amy McGoldrick, who's produced today's event, our sponsors, Fondation de France, and thank you to all of you for being part of the Alliance community today. Our next event is in September in partnership with Mercer and will cover investments. And later that month, alongside our print issue, we'll be hosting a live conversation on what it takes to decolonize philanthropy. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and see you next time.